The apartment on West 72nd Street had a view of the Dakota's entrance. Not perfect, but good enough. From the fourth-floor window, you could see who came and who went. You could watch the doorman change shifts. You could count the taxis. You could measure the rhythm of a December evening in Manhattan and know exactly when the moment would arrive. Mark David Chapman had been standing at that window on and off for 5 hours. Sometimes he sat. Sometimes he paced. Sometimes he just stared at his own reflection in the glass, trying to recognize the person looking back. The gun was in his coat pocket. Heavy. Real. He'd touch it every few minutes, just to make sure it was still there. As if it might disappear. As if this whole thing might turn out to be a dream he could wake up from. But it wasn't a dream. The gun was real. The plan was real. And the man he was waiting for would be home soon. Chapman wasn't alone in the apartment. A woman named Jude had let him stay there. She didn't know him well, didn't know what he was planning. She thought he was just a fan, one of the thousands who came to New York hoping to catch a glimpse of someone famous. She'd met him a few days earlier outside the Dakota. He'd seemed harmless, polite, a little odd maybe, but not dangerous. Never dangerous. He told her he was from Hawaii. Told her he worked with children. Told her about his wife and how much he loved her. Showed her pictures. Talked about his faith. About how he used to be lost, but now he was found. About how God had changed his life. Jude listened and nodded and thought he seemed sweet. Thought he seemed like someone who needed a friend. She had no idea he'd been carrying the gun the whole time they talked. Chapman had arrived in New York 4 days earlier. He'd flown from Hawaii with a specific purpose. Not impulse. Not sudden rage. This had been planned. Thought through. Rehearsed in his mind 1,000 times until it felt inevitable. He'd brought the gun with him on the plane. Checked it in his luggage. Legal. Permitted. Just another traveler with a declared firearm passing through security without a second glance. He'd checked into the Sheraton on 7th Avenue. Room 2730. Spent the first night reading. He'd brought a Bible. Brought a copy of The Catcher in the Rye. Kept them both on the nightstand like religious texts, like scriptures that explained something he couldn't explain himself. He'd underlined passages. Made notes in the margins. Tried to find meaning in the words that would justify what he was about to do. The next day he went to the Dakota. Stood outside with the other fans. Waited. And when the moment came, when John Lennon walked out with his wife beside him, Chapman had approached. Not with a gun, with an album. Double fantasy. Fresh. Just released. He'd held it out and asked for an autograph. His hands shook. His voice cracked. But he smiled. And John had stopped. Had taken the album, had signed his name across the cover in black ink while his wife waited, and Chapman's heart hammered in his chest. John had looked at him. Made eye contact. Said something kind. Something forgettable and human. Then he'd handed the album back and walked away toward the waiting car. Chapman had stood there holding the signed album and felt nothing. No satisfaction. No relief. No change in the hollow ache that had been growing inside him for months. He'd gotten what thousands of fans wanted. A moment. A signature. Proof that he existed in the same world as his idol. But it didn't matter. Because this wasn't about admiration anymore. This was about something darker. Something he couldn't name, but could feel spreading through him like poison. He'd gone back to his hotel room, sat on the bed, stared at the autograph, and realized that meeting John Lennon hadn't fixed anything, hadn't filled the emptiness, hadn't made him feel real. If anything, it made everything worse, because now John was human, flesh and blood, a man who signed albums and spoke kindly to strangers. And Chapman was still nobody, still invisible, still screaming into a void that never screamed back. That's when he knew he couldn't stop. That's when the plan stopped being a fantasy and became the only option left. He'd spent the next 2 days preparing, not the gun. That was ready. But himself. He called his wife in Hawaii, told her he loved her. Didn't tell her why. Didn't tell her what he was planning. Just said the words like a man saying goodbye without admitting it. She asked if he was okay. He said he was fine. The lie tasted like metal in his mouth. He read the Bible. Read The Catcher in the Rye. Read them both over and over, searching for permission, searching for a sign that what he was about to do was right, or necessary, or at least understandable. He found passages that seemed to speak to him. Verses about sacrifice. Chapters about phoniness. Words that twisted themselves into justification if you stared at them long enough. But deep down, in the place he didn't want to look, he knew the truth. This wasn't about God. This wasn't about literature. This wasn't even about John Lennon. This was about Mark David Chapman. About a man who'd spent his whole life feeling invisible and had decided that if he couldn't be loved, he'd be remembered. If he couldn't be somebody, he'd destroy somebody. And in that destruction, he'd become real. The day had been long, cold. December in New York had a weight to it. Chapman had walked the streets, bought a copy of the New York Times, sat in cafes and watched people live their lives. Normal people. People with jobs and families and futures. People who existed without needing to prove it. He envied them, hated them, wanted to be them, wanted to punish them for having what he couldn't have. He'd gone back to the Dakota in the afternoon, stood with the fans again, waited. But John didn't come out. Hours passed. The cold seeped into Chapman's bones. Other fans came and went. Some recognized him from the day before. Asked if he'd gotten his autograph. He showed them the album. They congratulated him, told him how lucky he was. He smiled and agreed and felt the gun in his pocket. That's when Jude had invited him up to her apartment. Said he looked frozen. Said he could wait inside where it was warm. Chapman had hesitated, not because he didn't want to, but because accepting kindness felt like a betrayal of what he was about to do, like he didn't deserve it. But he went anyway, because the cold was unbearable, because he needed somewhere to think, because even killers get tired of standing. So now he was here, in this apartment, looking out this window, watching the entrance. Waiting. Jude made him tea. Asked about Hawaii, about his wife, about what brought him to New York. Chapman answered, kept his voice steady, kept his hands still, played the part of a normal person having a normal conversation. But inside his mind was screaming. Inside he was counting down. Inside he was rehearsing the moment over and over until it felt like muscle memory. The hours crawled. 6 o'clock became 7. 7 became 8. Chapman checked his watch constantly. Wondered if John would come home at all. Wondered if this was a sign. If maybe God was giving him an out, a chance to walk away, to get on a plane back to Hawaii and pretend none of this ever happened. But he didn't move, didn't leave, just kept watching. Jude asked if he wanted dinner. He said no. She asked if he was okay. He said yes. She looked at him with concern in her eyes, the kind of look people give when they sense something wrong but don't know what. Chapman smiled, reassured her, told her he was just tired, just emotional about being in New York, just overwhelmed by everything. She believed him. Because people want to believe. Because suspecting someone of planning murder over tea in your apartment is too horrible to consider. So she smiled back and left him alone by the window. And Chapman stood there, touching the gun in his pocket, and thought about all the things that had led him here. The bullied childhood, the failed suicide attempts, the jobs he couldn't keep, the identities he'd tried on like costumes that never fit, the religion he'd embraced and abandoned, the voice in his head that kept telling him he was nothing, that he would always be nothing, that the only way to matter was to do something no one could ignore. He thought about John Lennon, about the music, about the interviews where John talked about peace and love and imagined no possessions while living in the Dakota, about the hypocrisy, about the phoniness, about how John had everything and Chapman had nothing, and how unfair that was, how unbearable. But underneath all that anger was something simpler, something sadder. Chapman didn't really hate John Lennon. He wanted to be John Lennon, wanted to be seen, wanted to be heard, wanted to matter. And if he couldn't have that, he'd take it. He'd steal it. He'd rip it away in a moment of violence that would echo forever. At 8:30, Jude said she was going to bed, asked if Chapman needed anything. He said no, thanked her for her kindness. She smiled and disappeared into her bedroom, and Chapman was alone again. Just him and the window and the gun and the weight. He thought about leaving, thought about just walking out, going back to the hotel, flying home, telling his wife everything and begging for help. He could still do that. It wasn't too late. Nothing had happened yet. He was just a man with a gun in his pocket. Just thoughts. Just intentions. Not actions. Not yet. But even as he thought it, he knew he wouldn't leave. Because leaving meant staying nobody. Leaving meant another 40 years of invisibility, another lifetime of screaming silently while the world ignored him. And he couldn't do that anymore, couldn't bear it, so he stayed. At 10:50, the limousine pulled up. Chapman saw it from the window. His heart stopped. Then started again, faster. This was it, the moment. Everything he'd planned, everything he'd imagined, becoming real. He grabbed his coat, checked the gun one more time, and walked out of Jude's apartment without saying goodbye. The cold hit him as soon as he stepped outside. The street was quiet. A few people walking, a few cars passing. Normal. Everything was normal except for the man with the gun walking toward the Dakota's entrance. He positioned himself in the shadows, close enough to see, close enough to act, but far enough not to be noticed. And he waited. Not long this time. Just minutes that felt like hours. The car stopped. The door opened. John stepped out first. Then, Yoko. They walked toward the entrance. John was carrying tapes. Studio work, late night, normal evening. Chapman stepped forward. His hand found the gun. His mind went blank, not thinking anymore, just moving, just doing. He called out, not John's name, just a sound, enough to make him turn. and when John turned, when their eyes met for the second time in 2 days, Chapman pulled the trigger. Not once. 5 times. The sound cracked through the December air like the world breaking. John fell. Yoko screamed. Chapman stood there, gun in hand, not running, not hiding, just standing, waiting for the police, waiting to be seen, waiting to finally be somebody. He pulled out the Catcher in the Rye, started reading, as if the words could explain, as if anything could explain. The police came, put him in handcuffs, asked him why. Chapman looked at them and said nothing that made sense. Because there was no sense. Just a hollow man who'd spent 5 hours in a stranger's apartment, drinking tea and staring out a window, preparing to murder someone he'd never met, to become someone he'd never be. And in those 5 hours, he could have chosen differently. Could have walked away. Could have asked for help. Could have recognized that fame earned through violence isn't fame at all. It's just another kind of invisibility, the kind that lasts forever. But he didn't know that yet. Wouldn't know it for years. Wouldn't understand it until the cameras stopped coming. Until his name became synonymous with waste. Until he was just another prisoner in a cell, invisible again, but this time with blood on his hands that would never wash away. Jude heard about it the next morning, realized who'd been standing in her apartment, who'd drank her tea, who'd stared out her window for 5 hours. She felt sick, violated, confused. Kept asking herself if there were signs, if she should have known, if she could have stopped it. But how could she? How can anyone see into another person's darkness when they're so good at hiding it? When they smile and say thank you and seem like just another lost soul looking for connection? The world mourned. Vigils, memorials, millions of people grieving a man they'd never met but who'd touched their lives through music, through words, through dreams of a better world. And in the center of that grief, barely mentioned, barely considered, was the man who'd taken it all away. The nobody who'd become somebody for the worst possible reason. Years later, Chapman would apologize, would say he was sorry, would claim he found God again, found meaning, found remorse. But the words were hollow, empty. Because sorry doesn't bring back the dead. Sorry doesn't undo 5 bullets. Sorry doesn't erase 5 hours spent preparing to destroy a life. All it does is prove that the person he was trying to kill was never really John Lennon. It was himself, the version of himself that could have chosen differently, that could have reached out instead of lashing out, that could have lived with invisibility instead of demanding to be seen through violence. But that version died on December 8th, in the 5 hours before he pulled the trigger. In the moment he decided that being remembered as a killer was better than being forgotten as a man. And now he sits in a cell, invisible again. While the world remembers John, remembers the music, remembers the message, and forgets the name of the man who thought murder would make him matter. Because in the end, that's what those 5 hours proved. You can plan, you can prepare, you can pull the trigger, but you can't kill your way into meaning. You can't shoot your way into significance. You can only destroy, and in that destruction, become exactly what you feared most. Nothing at all.